Subscribe to our YouTube channel and press the bell icon to get the latest updates.
The Print off the Cuff, presented by IIFL Wealth and Asset Management, powered by Raheja Corp, corporate partner AU Small Finance Bank, in association with global insurance brokers, airline partner SpiceJet.
The big question in the world today, as you might have seen even from the statements at G7 summit, is where did COVID-19 come from? Now, nobody seems to have a definitive answer except maybe Donald Trump. But a lot of scholarship and research is now coming out. And some of this is coming out from really reputed names who put their reputations on the line with their bylines. And one of those is Katherine Eban, who is investigative journalist and author, who's our guest on Off the Cuff today. Katherine Eban, besides other writings, also wrote the book Bottle of Lies, which is about generics, and that caused quite a bit of debate and discussion in India as well. And you will see the cover of that book as we talk. And you will also see the screenshot of the cover of the front page of her article in Vanity Fair. Now, the question is, until a couple of months ago, it was widely believed that this was a zoonotic transmission, that this virus had jumped zoonotically, that means from one animal to human beings, or from one animal to another animal to human beings, as has happened with SARS viruses in the past. We know that the earlier SARS virus jumped from bat to civet cats, which are not cats, and MERS jumped from bats to camels to human beings. This one we don't know yet. Now, a lot of evidence has come up, a lot of questions have come up over the last couple of months that seem to suggest that the possibility that this could have leaked from a lab, from the lab in Wuhan, China, can't be ruled out. Now, Katherine Eban has done this book-length article in Vanity Fair talking about this in great detail, looking at all the evidence. So, Katherine, after this sort of detailed introduction, I was inspired by your article. Welcome to Off the Cuff.
Thank you for having me. Pleasure to be here.
Thank you. And tell us, what is it? This is an ongoing debate. This was started by Trump and Pompeo. And now it's got more credibility and more fuel. What have you contributed? How have you taken it forward with this article?
So what I really set out to do was to peel away the conspiracy theories, and there are many of those, and those range all over the place. But, the idea that this was somehow a bioweapon intentionally released by China on the world, and peel away the agendas. And there are many people with dark agendas who are, pushing various narratives, and just look at what are the credible questions that deserve to be answered, and what was happening inside the U.S. government to pursue those credible questions. What happened to those questions? Did they get asked properly? Did they get answered properly? But in order to do that, and I'm sort of making the reporting effort sound simple, it was really tracking down these questions down to sort of the ground level, right? I mean, what deserves to be asked? What are the answers that are out there? And what did the U.S. government do to answer these questions? And, one of the things that became really clear as I was reporting this is that the investigation inside the U.S. government into this burning question, I mean, really, as you put it, the most important question in the world, the investigation was not adequate. It was not sort of fully formed, and it was not supported. And one of the questions that I had was why? Why didn't that happen? And, what I found was a sort of cross-hatching of agendas, conflicts of interest, concerns, and rightful concerns, one might say, about claims, conspiratorial claims that President Trump was making that were not at that time likely supported with real evidence. And so that's really what I tried to do in this article. And it did take me many words, as you note, book length treatment, not really, but, a long article to try to sort through all of that.
You also say that in Trump's times, because he took it up, this actually toxified the debate in a sense.
Absolutely. I mean, when he put it forward, and, this was, of course, the same president who was making sort of racial slurs about this virus and amping up hatred against Asian Americans and Asians around the world. I think the most responsible people did not want to be seen to be feeding into some sort of unwarranted claims that were going to have a very toxic result in the real world. But what happened was, once he left office, the questions remained. There has been no animal host or intermediate animal found for this virus, despite an intensive search and something like 80,000 animals, wildlife samples tested. So given that, these questions began to come back. And they really came roaring back after the World Health Organization, the report that they participated in, which was credulous, essentially, which did not really challenge an underlying narrative that it was zoonotic, and didn't do anything close to the kind of forensic, accounting of the lab leak question. There's no lab data, there's no records, there's no lab notebooks, there's no access, essentially, to underlying records. So given that, how is it that you get to discard one hypothesis in favor of the other? So, with that report pretty much being chalked up to a failure, the question became, well, what are we going to do? How is the world going to ever figure this out?
I figure you are disappointed with the World Bank's work, particularly that report and that investigation.
The World Health Organization. So, the report was not, it was conducted, so it was sort of overseen or involved the World Health Organization, but it was an independent body of experts. Those experts that were divided between Chinese and international experts, they went there, they had 2 weeks of quarantine in their hotel rooms. They had 2 weeks, in a kind of carefully scripted tour. And while they did some important work, I obtained a internal U.S. government analysis of that report, which just trashed it. Basically said that the report is self-contradictory. It cites work that has been taken down or debunked, and it did not do anything close to the actual analysis you'd need to make the conclusions it made.
In fact, that report is linked with your article.
Right.
The defense that we see from WHO is, where do we have the power to do any real investigation? How can you blame us? We depend entirely on the other countries' goodwill and support. So why blame us as an institution?
Well, yes, that's right. The World Health Organization is in a tough spot. It doesn't really have any authority, but I think that the head of the WHO, Tedros, opened the door when he said, for us, for the World Health Organization, all hypotheses remain on the table. In other words, we're looking at this report and we understand its shortcomings. Therefore, all hypotheses remain on the table. I think the question that a lot of people I interviewed asked is, how is it that you take one possibility off the table before you've investigated it, right? That's what they want to know.
Yeah. Now, you have looked at this very complex web of conflicts of interest.
Mm-hmm.
And you've simplified this in your article. Will you super simplify it now in 2 minutes?
Sure. So the US government is obviously a big funder of science. And after the SARS outbreak of 2002, they became big funders of virology research that aimed to sort of map the bat coronaviruses and kind of explore the risks of crossover or spillover to humans. Some of the research that they funded is called gain-of-function research. So it's somewhat risky research that basically aims to gauge the infectiousness of certain pathogens by altering them and trying to make them more infectious. Some of that funding went through an intermediary to the Wuhan Institute of Virology. That institute was doing this risky gain-of-function research at sort of low levels of lab security about 7 miles away from the epicenter of the outbreak, which was this Wuhan seafood market, or believed initially to be the epicenter of the outbreak. So, people are asking what some investigators in the US government found when they started looking into these connections is that there was a reluctance among sort of the bureaucratic establishment to really delve into all of these connections. They felt that they were being told to stop digging or they would open a can of worms. On the other side, bureaucrats that I interviewed felt, how can we go out there and make allegations about risky research and the Wuhan Institute of Virology without really knowing what happened? And we don't want to be making false accusations. So there was this, fight inside of the US government over how much to delve into this issue. So that is one of the things that my article was able to document.
This is more American politics, but doesn't it also tell us that Trump administration, for all its boasts, and Pompeo did not quite have a hold on what was going on in the State Department?
Well, I think that's right. I mean, people made the point to me that despite all of Donald Trump's huffing and puffing about China and, being tough on China and using slurs which I don't want to repeat, to describe this virus, they actually were not really coordinating a comprehensive investigation, nor were they successful at negotiating tough terms at the World Health Assembly over what was going to be looked at and how it was going to be looked at.
The key issue here is that if National Institute of Health, for example, wanted this research done, why did they have to use a cutout in EcoHealth Alliance? Why not just give these grants directly?
Well, that's a really good question, and I'm not sure I know the answer to that, except that EcoHealth Alliance had a model that it was able to very successfully market to the National Institutes of Health to say, post-SARS outbreak, we're going to work with these global laboratories. We're going to dispatch people into the remote areas and collect these bat samples and bring them back and analyze them. Now, I had people who say to me, that's insanity, right? If you are bringing potentially dangerous infectious samples from remotest areas where maybe they should be left untouched, back into these crowded urban areas, into labs that have, problematic safety regulations. So you can debate the science, but this was the model that EcoHealth Alliance was able to essentially market to the US government when it got its grants.
The line, if I remember from your article, although I've read so much now on this, I think it's from your article, that what they was doing, searching for these infectious viruses by bringing them from the wild into crowded cities, was like searching for a gas leak with a lit match. Yes,
that's right. That is what one critic of it described it as, and Peter Daszak, who heads EcoHealth Alliance, was pushing an effort called the Global Virome Project to dramatically expand that effort, which, as one critic said, it would be like looking for a gas leak with a blowtorch.
Not even a big match, a blowtorch, yes.
So, there is a lot of debate about the merits of this kind of work.
Have you thought sometimes, are you also inclined to believe that it's possible that this blowtorch lit a fire in Wuhan? There was a gas leak and the blowtorch got it.
I don't think that at the moment anything that is in the public domain is going to answer that question. How are we going to get closer to an answer? We may be able to get closer to an answer through intelligence findings of different governments. Maybe if China would cooperate, which it's stated clearly it is not inclined to do, if it was going to open up the laboratory to a kind of forensic scrutiny. The laboratory has this comprehensive database of coronavirus sequences, bat sequences, and it's been taken offline. And now nobody can have access to it. So, at the very least, we can say that there is a tremendous lack of transparency that in part has given rise to these questions.
So, in fact, we can also refer to the interview that Xi Zhengli has given to the New York Times that we just today, which basically shuts the door and says that there's no question of any scrutiny.
Right.
But is there... Sorry, please go ahead.
No, I was just going to say that the New York Times makes the point, we don't have any way to verify her denials because we can't have access to the laboratories. I mean, her denials are unverifiable. She's saying the claims against me, the allegations against me are unverifiable. The Times is saying her denials are unverifiable because, there's no way to cross-check them with records.
So what about the sense of responsibility that a nation must have when you're doing this kind of research, which has international implications and international partnership, funding, etc., etc.? Shouldn't it be not just morally, but even legally binding on you to be more transparent about this?
I mean, that is, so Xi Zhengli has basically sort of positioned the laboratory as a transparent hub of, international science. And there are sort of rules of the road and customs and some regulations over how these institutes are supposed to be conducted. But in this case, the Chinese government has come in and dropped a, steel door in front of the place.
Yeah. I'll now take a couple of questions from Sandhya Ramesh, who's our science editor. So the first question she wants to ask is, what were some of the biggest roadblocks you faced when working on the Vanity Fair story? Which part proved to be the most challenging? That's a journalist's question. Fair.
That's a really good question. I mean, the reporting was incredibly challenging, and I likened it to an Escher drawing where, you go up a staircase and you think you've come to the end, and then it turns again and you go back down the other side. So, it has this strange sort of funhouse effect where it is very hard to get down to the ground level of what questions matter and why they matter, and furthermore, kind of, you have an army of international sleuths now looking into this, and they're turning up all kinds of things. Some of them matter and some of them don't. So, for example, one of the things that matters was turned up by an ex-science teacher who lives in Eastern India. He's known on Twitter as The Seeker. And he started researching in this Chinese database of dissertations. He doesn't speak any Mandarin, so he would put keywords into this database and he would get a return of various academic papers written in China. He would put those through Google Translate, and by doing that, he came up with this master's thesis that was written in 2013 that opened, talk about a can of worms, raised all kinds of questions about what the Wuhan Institute of Virology might be hiding.
Yeah. Did you get to talk with him?
I did. Let me just say, here's another thing, which is, a number of people involved in this, researching this, are on use pseudonyms on the internet, and I don't use information from people hiding behind pseudonyms unless I can verify their identity. So he had only wanted to talk to me through, Twitter direct messages, and I said, I want to get on the phone. So we got on the phone, and that was how I was able to get more detail about how he'd figured this out.
Obviously, I'm not asking you to tell me who the person is. I hope he stays safe and okay. So follow-up questions from Sandhya. These are science questions. She says that except for a few in the letter in Science, how come so few virologists have come out to question the zoonotic transmission story? It's other scientists. And second, a linked question is that this sort of sensational, her word, not mine, sensational reporting around this possibility of a lab leak, even if warranted, isn't it now discouraging research in zoonosis?
So, first of all, this debate has become so heated in every direction. And I think a lot of virologists look at this landscape, which is full of, Twitter threats and funding threats, and think they don't want to get involved, which is understandable. Also, a lot of them get their funding. Some of them are funded through China. Some of them are funded through the National Institutes of Health. And they look at this and they wonder, what is the upside here of jumping into this? That said, there are scientists who have actually changed their view in both directions. So there was a group of scientists early on who said anybody who talks about a possible lab origin is trafficking and conspiracy theories. That silenced everybody for a while. Most recently, there's a group of scientists who came out and said we would need to look seriously at a possible lab origin. So, scientists are beginning to sort of change their views, some of them in both directions.
Take that forward. What that means is, or am I right to interpret this or translate this to mean that even say in the community of virologists, there are conflicts of interest in terms of where funding grants are coming from?
Sorry, repeat your question?
That even within the community of virologists, which is a small community, there are conflicts of interest in terms of where their funding is coming from. Or are there peer pressures?
I think there's both. I think there is tremendous peer pressure. And there are also conflicts of interest. And I think this was seen most clearly with Peter Daszak of EcoHealth Alliance, who, was behind the scenes orchestrated this letter in Lancet early on in the pandemic to say, anybody considering a lab leak hypothesis is trafficking in conspiracy theories. But behind the scenes, he was organizing this letter and trying to remove his fingerprints from it, essentially. And we know that because subsequent emails came out through a Freedom of Information group that was able to get those emails. So, there are definitely virologists whose self-interest is in a zoonotic origin. That doesn't mean that a zoonotic origin is wrong. Right. It doesn't mean that the lab leak is right, but it means that there are hidden interests that are have prevented a full assessment of the origin.
To me, philosophically, the strange thing is that we thought that political scientists, journalists, people who deal with imprecise sciences, they can have closed minds, but to see top bioscientists having closed minds, that one is the only possibility, the other is an impossibility. That's not the way to do bioscience or any science.
Well, it's interesting you say that, because I was struck as I interviewed, there's a group of scientists around the world who have become obsessed with this question. I mean, they research it, continuously. And each of them that I interviewed said sort of a version of the same thing to me, which is they were struck by how unscientific the scientists were acting. Why were the scientists acting so unscientific? Why did they want to take a hypothesis off the table before it had been fully investigated? And, as an investigative journalist, I relate to that point of view.
So was there a fear that if this comes out this way, this will actually hit a lot of virology research across the world? Because there was, again, I read from your writings elsewhere, that there was a fear that if you ban gain of function, you ban all of virology research.
Right. So, there's sort of concern in both directions. There's concern that that a restriction on gain of function research is really restricting sort of essentials of virology. How are you going to develop vaccines? How are you going to anticipate threats unless you can do this kind of cutting edge research? Conversely, there are people who say, well, the virologists stepped in to cut off a full inquiry into this because it would do to the field of virology. If it was proved to be a lab leak, it would do to the field of virology what Chernobyl did to the field of nuclear science.
Yeah, or 3 Mile Island.
Or 3 Mile Island, right.
Yes. But as we talk, there is a nuclear plant leak in China, although it's nothing like Chernobyl, fortunately, or 3 Mile Island, but that's also going on. I think it's a French collaboration, plant built with French collaboration. Now, Anisha Bedi, my colleague, again, it's a reporter's question. In your article, all these people have read your article, I promise you. And I will share a link again with our video when we put it out. She says that you mentioned that initial indications came out from some Chinese social media users. So what were those precise indications? Then we know that those were quickly snuffed out.
Right. So, I was able to sort of recreate the US government investigation into the question of origin. So there was a group in what's called the National Security Council, which is the sort of security council that advises the president. They were looking at this landscape, and it's not that there were, were there hawks inside of the Trump administration saying this is a lab leak? Yes. But the people who were really saying it was a lab leak were the Chinese, were the social media users, also Chinese scientists. So there was a paper early on by 2 Chinese scientists in Wuhan who said, where did this virus come from? Well, we've canvassed the area of Wuhan and we found these 2 labs doing coronavirus research. And they basically laid out this early picture, and the paper was removed from the internet. But, the US government took note of that.
Now, Peter Daszak, just to put it in perspective, he heads EcoHealth Alliance, which is used as a cutout or as a conduit for spreading these grants in this research, for this virus research across the world.
Yeah.
He first wrote a letter, or orchestrated a letter. And I must say that email exchange is delightful between him and Ralph Baring, who's running the other gain of function lab in North Carolina.
Right.
So he signed this letter and then said no conflict of interest. Letter in the Lancet, very early on, killing all discussion on the lab leak. Now it's been shown up to be a sham. Would you call him an honorable man?
You know, I would not. I would not characterize him one way or another, but I would just say that, you know, he and a number of people who worked for him or who got grants from him were signatories on that letter, and they signed that they had no conflicts of interest. But in fact, you know, Dashik had a tremendous financial interest in not considering a lab leak, because he had a very in-depth scientific collaboration with the Wuhan Institute of Virology, and he was sending grant money to them every year. So, you know, I would say that I think most people looking at that would say that he did have a conflict of interest.
As a taxpayer and as a citizen, would you be comfortable giving your money to him again to employ in research like this anywhere now? Well,
I wouldn't answer the question that way. I guess the way I would answer the question is with another question. You know, was there adequate control and oversight of where this research money was going to? So, you know, as one scientist I interviewed said to me, well, you know, we can fund the Wuhan Institute of Virology, which may be doing, you know, hostile military research in the back room, or we could fund like the Louis Pasteur Institute in France. So, you know, maybe the funding these facilities needs a very hard look.
So do you then think hard questions need to be asked of NIH and Dr. Fauci as well?
Sure. I mean, you know, I think hard questions need to be asked of any public officials, you know, when there are questions about funding risky research. Now, this whole debate was mediated in 2014 through 2017. There was a moratorium on funding of this kind of research, and then they brought the funding back in 2017 with a kind of oversight mechanism. But according to the people I interviewed, that oversight mechanism is full of holes and also full of secrecy, which is that the deliberations regarding what is funded is not public. You know, so I think that I would certainly argue at the very least in favor of full transparency when taxpayer dollars are involved.
Did you ever find a pushback from anywhere saying, I know that you have a reputation for not being pushed back, but did you find any urgings, pushback that why you getting into it? Don't open this can of worms. Same question.
You know, I didn't personally. I think I've gotten more pushback since the article pubbed online from all sides, you know, from left and right, you know, from scientists who are, you know, pummeling me for having delved into this, for people on the right who are claiming that my article has been critical of President Trump and his efforts. So it seems that it is an article that has satisfied nobody, and maybe that's the best place to be. I don't know.
So in the middle of the conversation, I'll take also some questions from our viewers. Pritha Chakravarti, she's a journalism student. So it's a journalism student's question, but she must have her say. What are the basic things a journalist should keep in mind? Not just at work, but through their life in the profession.
Um, I think one of the very important things journalists have to keep in mind is to be fair. It's very critical to be fair when you, whatever you're writing, whatever you're stating, you need to give people an opportunity to comment and respond. You need to be able to differentiate between what are conspiratorial allegations and what is reality. And I know that there is a big debate about reality these days and what it is. But I think that's critical. I also think, you have to not be intimidated. You just, I try to be as sort of factual and straightforward and open-minded and fair as I can in my reporting.
Yeah. So tell us, what is the next thing that the US and the rest of the world can do to get to the bottom of this? Or do you think it's quite possible that we'll never find out?
First of all, I do think it is possible we will never find out. Yes, I think it's possible. Or we may find out so long from now that it won't help us inform next steps as how to protect ourselves, right? But President Biden has asked for a 90-day review. He's asked his intelligence agencies to go back to the drawing board, look at the evidence, look at the intelligence, and try to get closer to some kind of answer or estimate as to what the origin might be. I would imagine that his call to his intelligence agencies has triggered a similar effort in governments around the world. That said, it is still possible that we will not know the answer. And I think without more transparency from China, it will be almost impossible to take the lab leak hypothesis off the table. I mean, I think it's important to keep in mind that these questions are not just being invented out of thin air. They're being asked because there have not been answers we can get from China at the moment.
I shall tell you a secret. Secret is that we were talking about the possibility of a lab leak at Wuhan, etc., and COVID-19. And we sent word out to our subscribers to ask questions. And these are subscribers' questions. And all of these are about your book, about Bottle of Lies. Not one of these is about. So it tells you that you really struck a chord in India. And I will take up some of those questions. But if I may persist with the virus, the longer and the more stoutly the Chinese decide not to cooperate, the more guilty they look, isn't it?
Sorry, ask that question again.
I said the more resistant the Chinese look, and the more close the Chinese look to sharing any more facts, the more guilty they look.
I think that one can argue that. I mean, this is all happening with the absence of candor from China. And the questions aren't diminishing, they're growing, right? So China could respond by saying, we're going to share everything. World, come into the lab, look at the lab notebooks. Here's the database. Here's what we know. Here's what we don't know. I think had they done that, I think it would have changed things tremendously. But, essentially the lab remains on the suspect list because these questions cannot be answered.
So I think next the Chinese have to let you get into the lab and open their records up to you. How did you get started with this story?
Well, my editor and I were just putting our heads together and thinking, partly with the COVID outbreak sort of coming under control in the U.S., U.S. journalists could sort of take a step back and look around a little bit. And, so my editor and I were asking, what are the big unanswered questions here? And we both agreed that this was one. And so I just decided, I thought very early that the way I wanted to approach this story was by looking at what had happened inside the US government as to what they knew or thought at the time and how they pursued it.
So now I'll take a couple of questions on your book.
Okay.
What kind of response do you get, say, from the Indian side on your book? Because India takes great pride in its generics industry. And I know many people said that you took one company, which for good reasons got into serious trouble, to generalize about Indian generics industry. How much is it that you found wrong with Indian generics? And then I have a question from Abhishek Agarwal from ICICI Bank, who says, why is there such abhorrence towards generic medicines? Everybody wants branded medicines.
Okay, so two questions there. You know, obviously Ranbaxy became a case study in drug company corruption. You know, what they did was terrible. And they pled guilty to 7 felonies in a US court related to data falsification and manipulation. But my question then for the reporting was, well, you know, where did Ranbaxy's conduct come from? Were they just an outlier in the industry? And what my reporting uncovered was that, no, they are not an outlier. The industry works like this. There is a race to get regulatory approval, to facilitate approvals, to greenlight that, because that is the sort of cash market approvals are the spigot. They're the cash spigot for the industry. And so I had information from a number of whistleblowers from different generic drug companies, coupled with observations from US inspectors who went into plants from a number of different companies and found data manipulation and data falsification. So I believe that in my book, I was able to show that, in fact, Ranbaxy was not such an outlier.
Now I have somebody from an Indian generics company, that is
Okay.
from Cadila Pharmaceuticals, who says, how can we promote innovations leading to generic product development?
Say that question again.
How can we promote innovations leading to generic product development?
How can one do that better?
Yeah.
Well, I think that, you know, the generic industry needs to demonstrate that it is as concerned about quality as it is about low cost, right? The big selling point for the generic industry has been its low cost. But I think given the revelations that have come out, I think that the best promotional approach is to demonstrate that it is an industry that is equally concerned with quality.
Colonel Achar Sridharan, he's a veteran who says, I've just ordered your book, Bottle of Lies. He has. I do not find many doctors prescribing generic drugs in India, and he blames it on aggressive medical salesmen, pharma salesmen who barge into doctors' of clinics, offer them freebies, etc., etc. And then he says that the same drug is manufactured under 20 different brand names by 20 firms. How do we presume that all of them are equally good and safe?
That's a great question, and it's very hard to know. So, you know, one of the things that I found, which was pretty troubling, is that generic companies reserve some of their better manufacturing for export markets, while they're selling lower quality drugs to the Indian public. That was one of the more troubling things that I learned, and it's a very common practice. It's called dual track production. So I think it is very hard for an Indian consumer to know that they are getting a high quality generic when it is intended for the generic market.
I know you have a hard stop, so I'll just take Last couple of questions. Ravi Shankar, who wants to know how will the future evolve if such research is conducted undercover and never open to any investigation, even after there is so much suspicion on the subject?
I'm not sure if he's talking about my investigation or if he's
the virus lab.
Okay. So read the question again.
How will the future evolve if such research is conducted undercover and never open to any investigation, even after there is so much suspicion on the subject?
Well, it's a great question. You know, there needs to be transparency from the Wuhan Institute of Virology. They need to put their database back up online. And I think they independent international investigators need access to data from their experiments. So I think that there is, you know, without that, it's very hard to move forward.
There's another question back to drugs. Okay. I think it's a valid question. That it's one thing to say that regulation was poor in India, that a lot of corners were being cut, but how prevalent is the practice of manipulation and getting new drug approvals by US FDA using inadequate or manipulated data?
Well, you know, my book is pretty tough on the US FDA. I mean, I basically describe our regulators as overseeing the industry on an honor system because they are relying on data from companies and they are not actually testing the drugs. So, you know, the book is really an argument for verification, having independent verification built into the regulatory system.
Now, Arhan Bengani, who's from Sweden, says how difficult it is to do investigative journalism with the changing in technologies, especially with so many surveillance tools. Did you ever feel surveilled while doing this? That's my question.
You know, I think with my reporting, I do a lot of sort of old-fashioned shoe leather reporting. I try to get documents. I always try to get documents and try to get independent, contemporaneous documentation, not stuff that's like written up later, you know, emails, minutes of meetings, text messages, WhatsApp messages. I mean, just, you know, because you can begin to look at what is true or not when you get an insight into what was happening at that moment on the ground. So I'm always pushing for ways to verify claims that are being made. And without that kind of verification, I would never print anything that, you know, people are just saying to me.
Did you ever feel surveilled given the fact the Chinese knew what you were doing?
You know, it's interesting that you asked that question because when I was reporting Bottle of Lies and I went to China and I was tailed by the Chinese security services and they actually hacked my phone. And I learned at that moment that I am no match for the Chinese government's, you know, computer skills. You know, I don't want to talk more right now about what I may have observed or not observed as I was reporting this article, but they certainly take note of a lot of things.
So the very last question, how does science, particularly bioscience, restore public faith in itself?
You know, I think there is a transparency problem at the moment. And I think all scientists should be pushing for a transparent, independent investigation into the origin of COVID-19, regardless of what the findings are. And I don't think that they should be, you know, threatening people on Twitter lodging death threats against fellow scientists who, consider alternative hypotheses. So I think that what would make the most sense is for every scientist to want an independent, transparent investigation at this point.
That's an excellent note to conclude on. And also, Katherine, as I thank you and we conclude, a word of gratitude also to these people who are people in the group called Drastic, who you talk about, who are working across the world and collaborating to get to the bottom of this with no incentive other than curiosity.
That is true. Yes, that's true.
So I hope let's hope at least they find out something. And when they do, I know that we'll hear it first from Katherine. So Katherine, thank you very much. And thanks most of all for being there.
Thank you very much. I appreciate the opportunity to speak with you.
The Print Off the Cuff, presented by IIFL Wealth and Asset Management, powered by Raheja Corp, corporate partner AU Small Finance Bank, in association with global insurance brokers, airline partner SpiceJet.